December 1943, a thin veil of frost coated the wire fences of Camp Ellisville, Alabama. In the dim blue light of dawn, the sound of a bugle echoed softly over rows of wooden barracks. From the kitchen block came the smell of bacon and brewed coffee, curling upward into the cold air. German prisoners, wrapped in thick overcoats marked PW, stood quietly in line, their breath visible against the pale winter sun. Behind them, American guards leaned against the railings, chatting lazily, cigarettes glowing in the half-light. Inside the mess hall, trays clattered as cooks ladled out scrambled eggs, buttered toast, and oatmeal, a breakfast that looked more like home than captivity. Private Hans Keller, 22, once a mechanic from Cologne, stared at his plate in disbelief. Across the room, another man laughed aloud, marveling at the absurdity of being fed better here than at the front. Outside, a group of Americans tossed a baseball back and forth, the ball's rhythm thudding through the frozen stillness. For many of the captured soldiers, this was the first morning they felt warmth, not from a gunfire lull, but from a nation that fed its enemies hot meals and let them watch a game. By late 1942, the tides of war had begun to shift. Across the deserts of North Africa and the coasts of Sicily, German troops, once the embodiment of unstoppable precision, were now surrendering by the thousands. For the Allies, the question was no longer if the enemy would be captured, but what to do with them. The United States, with its vast interior untouched by bombing raids and blessed with space and resources, became the logical destination for tens of thousands of Axis prisoners. Between 1942 and 1945, over 425,000 German soldiers would be shipped across the Atlantic, landing on American soil as prisoners of war. They arrived by the thousands, often aboard converted Liberty ships escorted by destroyers. For men accustomed to the claustrophobic tunnels of North Africa or the ruins of the Eastern Front, the first sight of America was surreal: endless greenery, orderly rail yards, and a silence untouched by sirens. Upon arrival, most were sent to temporary processing centers: Camp Shanks in New York, Fort Devens in Massachusetts, or Camp Shelby in Mississippi. From there, they were distributed to nearly 700 branch and base camps scattered across 46 states. These camps were often built near military installations, farmland, or manufacturing centers where wartime labor shortages had become critical. The American public knew little about the conditions behind those barbed wires. What filtered through the newspapers was simple: Axis prisoners are being held in accordance with the Geneva Convention. But inside, daily life told a different story, one that would later astonish the German prisoners themselves. Each camp was a small, self-contained world. Rows of wooden barracks stretched in perfect symmetry. A perimeter of double fencing enclosed not just the prisoners, but also the small comforts of an ordinary life: dining halls, classrooms, chapels, and recreation grounds. The War Department had decided early on that the best way to maintain order was through routine and fairness. Each prisoner received a bed, blanket, and access to showers. Rations were calculated to match the diet of American soldiers, not out of generosity, but out of compliance with international law. Yet even this baseline exceeded what many Germans had known in years of war. The Geneva Convention of 1929 had stipulated humane treatment for prisoners of war: food, shelter, medical care, and access to mail. But America went beyond mere compliance. With agricultural production still thriving and supply lines secure, food was abundant. German prisoners received fresh bread, meats, vegetables, and coffee. Red Cross parcels added luxuries such as chocolate, jam, and sometimes cigarettes. For many, it was the first time in years they had eaten a meal without rationing or fear of air raids. Cigarettes, too, became an unexpected symbol of peace. Every POW was issued a daily allowance, matching U.S. soldiers' rations. To the Americans, it was routine. To the Germans, it was almost unbelievable. Cigarettes had long been a battlefield currency in Europe, scarce, coveted, and traded for survival. Now, they were handed out freely by their captors. Some prisoners joked that if this was defeat, it felt strangely civilized. Yet the most profound shock came not from the food or the cigarettes, but from the way they were treated. Guards addressed prisoners by rank, not number. Inspections were formal but calm. Beatings were prohibited. Discipline, when necessary, was enforced through structure, not cruelty. The contrast with Nazi propaganda was staggering. Back home, they had been told that capture by Americans meant starvation, torture, or worse. Instead, they found baseball diamonds, orchestras, and language classes waiting inside the fences. These early days defined the tone for the rest of their captivity. America's POW system became a machine of order and quiet persuasion, an experiment in humanity conducted during total war. To Washington, humane treatment was not just a moral statement. It was strategic. Every prisoner well-fed and well-treated in the United States meant one more potential goodwill ambassador in post-war Germany. Still, for the men behind the wire, disbelief lingered. The warm meals, the fair treatment, the quiet decency, it all felt unreal. At night, as the camp lights dimmed and trains wailed in the distance, some prisoners wondered if it was a trick, a temporary illusion before punishment arrived. Yet day after day, the kindness continued. The same breakfast, the same baseball game, the same unthreatening guards leaning on fences, smoking and laughing as if war existed only on another planet. That quiet normalcy was the beginning of a transformation few had expected. The question was no longer what captivity looked like, but how it would change those living through it. By 1943, the American system for handling German prisoners had become one of the most organized and humane detention networks in the world. Each camp was overseen by the U.S. Army's Provost Marshal General's office, ensuring that Geneva Convention standards were not only met but exceeded. Daily life followed a strict rhythm. Morning roll call, breakfast, work details, mail distribution, recreation, and lights out by 10 p.m. Within these walls, the rhythm of war had been replaced by a strange, peaceful routine, one built not on fear, but on order and structure. Meals were a central part of that order. Every camp maintained large mess halls where food was served with military precision. The average German prisoner consumed between 3,000 and 3,500 calories a day, equivalent to an American soldier's ration. Breakfast included oatmeal, eggs, or pancakes with syrup. Lunch often featured stew, potatoes, and bread, while dinners could include roast meat, rice, and vegetables. For men who had grown used to black bread and watery soup, this abundance bordered on luxury. It was not uncommon for POWs to send letters home describing the meals with astonishment, sometimes cautiously, knowing that censors might suspect exaggeration. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The prisoners were eating better than many civilians in war-torn Germany. Beyond food, the Americans allowed prisoners to maintain a sense of dignity. Each camp had chaplains, sometimes German, sometimes American, who held religious services on Sundays. There were libraries filled with German-language books donated by universities and classrooms where POWs could learn English, mathematics, or mechanics. The Red Cross regularly inspected facilities and distributed parcels containing coffee, chocolate, and writing materials. These acts weren't born of sentimentality. They were policy, deliberate moves to uphold moral authority and demonstrate that democracy, even in war, could be humane. Still, not everything was idyllic. The U.S. Army remained wary of internal politics within the camps. Among the prisoners were both hardline Nazis and ordinary conscripts, and ideological divisions often ran deep. Some camps saw incidents where Nazi loyalists intimidated or attacked fellow Germans who showed signs of Americanization or cooperation. The military solution was subtle but effective: separate the diehards from the moderates, creating distinct compounds to reduce conflict. In doing so, the Americans unwittingly accelerated an internal reckoning among German soldiers, forcing many to confront the moral contradictions of the regime they once served. For local communities near these camps, the sight of German prisoners working in the fields was initially shocking. Many townspeople expected hostility or escape attempts. Instead, they saw quiet discipline. Under careful supervision, POWs picked cotton, harvested crops, repaired roads, and even built furniture. Farmers who once feared them began to exchange small gestures of trust, a shared lunch, a cigarette, a nod of thanks at the end of a day's work. By 1944, these prisoners had become an invisible part of America's wartime labor force, keeping farms and factories running while American men fought overseas. Then there was baseball, the most American of symbols. Nearly every large camp had its own baseball field, built either by the guards or the prisoners themselves. To the Germans, the sport was a mystery at first. Strange rules, curved throws, and the quiet poetry of teamwork without aggression. But soon, it became a fascination. Prisoners organized their own leagues, built wooden bats, and stitched balls from scraps of leather. Games were played on weekends, sometimes watched by amused American guards. On the field, hierarchy dissolved, captains, corporals, and cooks became teammates. The thud of a ball into a glove, the roar of laughter after a missed catch, the cheer of victory, these moments of humanity blurred the line between captor and captive. As months turned into years, the camps evolved from mere holding centers into something unexpected, cultural laboratories. Inside the fences, the Germans experienced democracy in miniature, fairness, debate, education, and recreation. For many, it was their first exposure to such values, and it quietly planted seeds that would bloom long after the war. By late 1944, the disbelief that once defined their early days had softened into reluctant admiration. America had fed them, educated them, and given them dignity, not because they deserved it, but because law and conscience demanded it. The same men who had marched under the swastika were now standing in lines for baseball games, holding hot coffee instead of rifles. What began as captivity was becoming transformation. And as the war's end drew closer, that transformation would reach its turning point, when disbelief gave way to understanding and respect emerged from defeat. To understand why German prisoners were so astonished by their treatment in American camps, one must see the experience through multiple lenses, human, tactical, and logistical. Each reveals a different truth about how the world's bloodiest war produced one of its most humane paradoxes, a nation fighting for survival but feeding its enemies with compassion. From the human angle, captivity in America reshaped the very idea of what it meant to be defeated. For the average German soldier, surrender was synonymous with humiliation and suffering. Nazi propaganda had warned that capture by the Americans meant starvation and cruelty. Yet the reality within U.S. camps was the opposite. Here, discipline was strict but not brutal. Prisoners woke at dawn, stood for roll call, and worked or studied during the day. But the tone was orderly, not oppressive. Guards were trained to maintain professionalism, not vengeance. The prisoners noticed. They were addressed by rank, not number, a subtle but powerful gesture that restored a measure of dignity stripped away by war. Over time, that dignity softened their fear. They wrote home about it, cautiously at first, describing how the enemy treated them not as beasts, but as men. For many, this humane treatment sparked the first quiet doubts about the ideology that had once ruled their lives. The tactical angle reveals America's deeper calculation. Humane treatment was not merely kindness, it was strategy. The War Department understood that moral conduct had practical value. Treating German POWs well would encourage reciprocal behavior toward Allied soldiers held in Europe. Beyond that, it served a psychological purpose. By showing mercy, America hoped to erode the myths of Nazi superiority and total loyalty. Every hot meal, every cigarette, every baseball game became a silent weapon in an ideological battle, one fought not with guns, but with decency. The United States was also keenly aware that post-war Germany would need rebuilding, not destruction. The men behind those fences were the nation's future, engineers, teachers, craftsmen, and their impressions of democracy could shape the Europe that followed. In that sense, every POW camp became a classroom in American values, carefully observed by those once taught to hate them. From the technological and logistical angle, the scale of America's effort was extraordinary. Managing nearly 500,000 prisoners across a continent demanded precision. Each camp was a microcosm of efficiency, water systems, kitchens, medical wards, and supply chains all functioning with military order. Food shipments arrived by rail, distributed through regional depots to ensure consistent rations. Cigarettes were imported by the millions, part of standard military procurement. Even sports equipment, from bats to gloves, came from the same factories supplying U.S. troops. The organizational challenge was immense, but it reflected the broader strength of America's wartime machine, a nation capable of feeding not only its own armies, but also its captives. This efficiency was not lost on the prisoners. Many marveled at how their guards never seemed hungry, how supplies never ran short, how the smallest town had electricity and running water. For men raised on tales of decadent, chaotic democracies, this orderliness left a lasting impression. America's industrial abundance, visible even inside a prison camp, became a silent teacher, proof that democracy could be both disciplined and powerful. Yet this order came with a human heartbeat. Behind every administrative report were people. Cooks stirring pots before sunrise, nurses tending to sick prisoners, officers inspecting barracks for fairness. The system's success relied not just on policy, but on empathy. There were moments when guards shared coffee with prisoners, when translators helped men write letters to families they thought were lost. Some guards had German ancestry themselves, and conversations in broken dialects bridged the gap between enemies. Such moments did not erase the war, but they reminded both sides of their shared humanity, a fragile thread of understanding in an age of destruction. For the prisoners, these small gestures carried immense weight. A hot meal was not just nourishment. It was proof that their lives still mattered. A cigarette offered by a guard was not merely tobacco. It was an acknowledgement of equality. And a baseball game, a pastime foreign yet magnetic, became a symbol of something they had almost forgotten: joy without fear. Through these simple experiences, the German POWs were exposed to a version of America far removed from Nazi caricatures. The land they had been taught to see as barbaric turned out to be astonishingly civilized, efficient, and free. In the span of months, disbelief turned to curiosity, and curiosity to quiet respect. Some prisoners began to question their old beliefs. Others simply marveled at the contrast between the comfort of captivity and the misery that had been promised. The paradox of being treated kindly by the enemy left deep marks on their psyche, marks that would resurface when they eventually returned to a shattered Germany. Each of these angles, human compassion, strategic calculation, and logistical power, converged to create something remarkable: an enemy treated with humanity in the midst of total war. It was a lesson that would echo far beyond the fences of those camps, shaping not only the memories of the men who lived through it, but also the moral identity of a nation determined to win without losing its soul. The experience of German prisoners in American camps cannot be fully understood without exploring the cultural, psychological, and moral dimensions that unfolded behind those fences. These were not merely footnotes in the history of World War II. They were windows into a profound clash between ideology and humanity. From the cultural angle, baseball became the unexpected bridge between two worlds. To the Americans, it was just a pastime, a way to fill long afternoons and keep discipline relaxed. But to the Germans, it was something deeper, almost symbolic. At first, they watched from the sidelines, puzzled by the strange choreography, pitchers winding up, batters swinging at invisible threats, players running in circles for reasons that made no sense. Yet over time, curiosity overtook confusion. Some prisoners asked to join, learning the rules from guards or fellow inmates who had picked them up quickly. What began as observation became participation. Soon, entire leagues formed within the camps, complete with rival teams, handmade uniforms, and nicknames. The sound of cheering echoed across the compounds, laughter, shouts, and applause filling spaces once ruled by silence. Baseball, in a strange way, became the language of peace. It taught teamwork, fair play, and respect for rules, lessons that subtly mirrored the democratic ideals outside the wire. For men who had grown up under rigid hierarchy and blind obedience, this free-spirited game offered a glimpse of a different kind of order, one built on mutual respect rather than command. From the enemy's perspective, disbelief gave way to reflection. Many German soldiers arrived expecting retribution. Nazi propaganda had painted the Americans as degenerate and cruel, a nation of racial chaos and moral decay. Instead, they found guards who were polite, meals that were hot, and treatment that was lawful. This cognitive dissonance was powerful. For younger prisoners especially, it shattered deeply rooted stereotypes. Letters home revealed a quiet astonishment. "We eat better here than we did at the front," wrote one POW from Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma. "They even give us cigarettes and let us play games." For older officers, the experience was more complicated. Some refused to accept it as genuine kindness, convinced it was propaganda meant to weaken German resolve. But as months passed, skepticism softened. They saw consistency, the same fairness, the same decency, day after day. The enemy, it seemed, truly believed in rules. That realization was more unsettling than any interrogation. It suggested that the very values Germany had mocked as weakness, freedom, fairness, empathy, were in fact sources of strength. The moral and legal angle further illuminates why America's treatment of prisoners stood out in wartime history. While Allied and Axis powers alike had signed the Geneva Convention, few applied it with the same thoroughness as the United States. American policymakers understood that the eyes of the world were watching. To treat the enemy cruelly would invite retaliation against American captives in Europe and risk moral hypocrisy at home. But there was also a deeper conviction at play, a belief that democracy could not compromise its principles, even in total war. The War Department issued strict orders against abuse. Inspections were frequent, Red Cross visits routine, and records meticulously kept. When isolated incidents of mistreatment occurred, they were investigated and punished. This moral discipline was deliberate. America wanted to prove that justice, not hatred, governed its conduct, that even in conflict, the line between civilization and savagery must never blur. Yet the policy had its critics. Some American civilians and politicians argued that the government was being too generous. Newspapers occasionally ran headlines like "Nazi prisoners eat better than our citizens." Wartime rationing had left many families struggling, and photos of smiling POWs playing baseball fueled resentment. To counter such criticism, officials emphasized reciprocity. Humane treatment here meant safety for Americans abroad. But beneath the public justification was a quieter truth. The treatment of POWs had become a moral experiment in how to remain human while waging a global war. Inside the camps, that morality translated into moments of quiet transformation. German prisoners who once worshipped discipline began to admire fairness. Those who once equated freedom with chaos saw it functioning smoothly, even in captivity. The baseball fields, the orderly mess halls, the libraries, all of them became classrooms of democracy. What textbooks could not teach, experience did. And when the prisoners were finally released years later, many carried those lessons home. Some would later become advocates for reconciliation, teachers, engineers, or local leaders in post-war Germany, men who had learned the power of civility from within the walls of an enemy's prison. In hindsight, the American POW camps were not merely places of detention. They were microcosms of the world that would follow 1945, a preview of how nations might rebuild not through domination, but through example. While the war raged elsewhere with bombs and blood, inside these quiet fences another kind of battle was being fought, a moral one. And it was being won not by force, but by fairness. That fairness would soon be tested as the war drew toward its violent climax. Across Europe, cities were burning, empires collapsing, and prisoners waiting anxiously for a future none could imagine. But within the heart of America, behind the barbed wire and baseball fields, a quiet revolution of the human spirit was already underway, one that would change how enemies saw each other forever. By the spring of 1944, the German prisoners across America had settled into a rhythm that felt almost unreal. What had begun as shock and disbelief had now become routine. The sound of morning bugles, the clang of tin trays, the smell of coffee drifting from the mess hall, and the laughter that echoed from the baseball fields. In Camp Hearn, Texas, one of the largest German POW centers in the United States, this sense of strange normalcy reached its peak. Every morning, hundreds of men lined up neatly for breakfast, scrambled eggs, sausage, toast, and steaming cups of coffee served on metal trays. Outside, guards leaned lazily on the fences, watching the sun rise as though the war were a distant rumor rather than a daily reality. For many prisoners, that contradiction, being enemies yet living in peace, began to stir something deeper. They were trained to see America as the land of chaos and decadence, a society too soft to stand against the disciplined power of the Reich. But here, within these fences, discipline and decency coexisted. Everything ran on time. Food was never late. Cigarettes never ran out. Punishment was rare, and when it came, it followed clear rules. Even the guards treated them with a strange sense of formality, firm but respectful. The longer they lived in captivity, the more difficult it became to reconcile this order with the image of America their leaders had painted. The turning point came in the most unlikely of places on the baseball field. Camp Hearn had a large open yard where prisoners had built their own diamond, complete with chalk baselines, wooden benches, and a rough-hewn backstop of wire mesh. Every Sunday, they gathered to play. Teams from different barracks competed, with guards occasionally umpiring the matches. The games were spirited but friendly, and over time, they became a spectacle that drew the entire camp, Germans and Americans alike. One Sunday afternoon, under a cloudless Texas sky, a game began that would become legendary among the prisoners. The Rhine River Rollers, a team made up of young Afrika Korps soldiers, faced the Luft Eagles, a group of former aircrewmen captured in Tunisia. The guards, amused by the intensity of the players, decided to watch. As the innings passed, something remarkable happened. A guard accidentally made a controversial call, a strike instead of a ball. The crowd of German players erupted in protest. For a moment, tension hung in the air. Back home, such defiance against authority could have led to punishment. But here, the guards simply laughed, tossed the ball back, and told them to keep playing. The crowd roared with laughter, and the game went on. That small act, the freedom to disagree without fear, hit harder than any propaganda leaflet ever could. By the seventh inning, the two teams were tied. A young private named Otto Weber stepped up to bat. He had been captured in North Africa and carried with him deep resentment toward his captors. But as he swung and connected with the ball, sending it soaring high over the field as both Americans and Germans cheered, something shifted. For the first time, he wasn't fighting, surviving, or obeying orders. He was simply playing. When he rounded the bases and saw his teammates rush to greet him, their laughter filled the air, drowning out the faint hum of the guard towers. It was a moment of pure humanity, a moment where the war, for just a heartbeat, disappeared. After the game, guards and prisoners shared coffee and cigarettes near the field. Conversations began, hesitant at first, then natural. Some exchanged words in broken English or German. Others gestured and smiled. They talked about families, hometowns, food, and music. One guard showed a photograph of his children. A German prisoner nodded quietly, pulling from his pocket a creased photo of his own. For the first time, both sides saw each other not as enemies, but as men, ordinary, exhausted, and yearning for normal life. But not everyone in the camp saw this transformation as harmless. Among the hardline Nazi prisoners, resentment grew. They viewed the games, the laughter, and the casual friendship with guards as betrayal, proof that some of their comrades were being softened by enemy propaganda. Rumors began to circulate that certain prisoners were turning American. Tensions simmered beneath the surface, and one evening, a confrontation broke out in a barracks. A loyalist officer accused another of dishonoring the fatherland for playing baseball with guards. Voices rose, fists flew, and the camp's MPs had to intervene. No one died, but the message was clear. The old world of ideology was colliding with a new world of humanity. For the Americans, the fight was troubling, but also revealing. The ideological fracture within the German ranks showed that the U.S. approach, discipline with dignity, was working. The humane treatment had become a quiet weapon, eroding the unity of Nazi loyalty from within. Reports from the Provost Marshal General's office later noted that prisoners who participated in camp activities, especially sports and education programs, were noticeably less hostile and more cooperative. Baseball, it turned out, was not just recreation, it was psychological diplomacy. As the summer of 1944 progressed, the camps continued to hum with this uneasy peace. Outside the fences, the war was reaching its most violent phase. D-Day had landed thousands of Americans on French shores, and the world's focus was on Normandy, not on a baseball field in Texas. Yet, in that small corner of America, something quietly profound was unfolding. Defeated men were learning to live without hate, and their captors were proving that mercy could coexist with strength. The next months would test that fragile balance, as new prisoners arrived carrying the bitterness of a collapsing empire. But for those who had been there longest, the transformation was already underway, and it had begun not with a speech or a law, but with the crack of a bat and the smell of morning coffee. By late 1944, the transformation that had begun quietly on baseball fields and in mess halls was becoming undeniable. Across dozens of camps, from Georgia to Iowa, from California to Pennsylvania, the same story repeated itself. The disbelief of captivity had turned into a strange respect. German prisoners, once proud symbols of the Third Reich, were now living in the heart of the nation they had been told was decadent and weak, and they were discovering that everything they had been taught about America was a lie. In Camp Concordia, Kansas, the largest German POW camp in the Midwest, a major event took place that symbolized this shift. A camp-wide baseball tournament was organized, complete with banners, handmade uniforms, and cheering crowds of prisoners and guards alike. For weeks, anticipation built as each team advanced through the brackets. Some played purely for sport. Others played to prove something deeper, that they had adapted, learned, and could coexist without hatred. On the day of the final match, the stands were packed. Prisoners waved makeshift flags with team names. Guards leaned on the fences smiling, and the camp loudspeaker played swing music from a nearby American radio station. The scene could have been mistaken for any small-town American gathering, except that the players were all wearing khaki uniforms marked PW on the back. When the first pitch was thrown, the crowd erupted. It was not just a game, it was a shared ritual. The tension of the early days of captivity had long melted away. The players joked, guards shouted encouragement, and every home run drew thunderous applause for both sides. The moment that would be remembered most, however, came during the final inning. A fly ball soared high in a left field, and a guard instinctively ran forward, catching it barehanded. The crowd fell silent for a moment, and then exploded in laughter. The guard grinned, tossed the ball back to the pitcher, and the game went on as if nothing had happened. In that brief instant, all barriers between captor and captive vanished. After the game ended, with handshakes and good-natured teasing all around, the German players gathered near the dugout, talking quietly among themselves. One of them, a former officer from the Afrika Korps named Lieutenant Franz Becker, later told a reporter, "It was the first time in years that I forgot there was a war." His words echoed the sentiment of many. For these men, the simple act of playing baseball in an enemy camp had become an experience of humanity that no amount of propaganda could erase. But the transformation ran deeper than morale. Many prisoners began taking part in education programs organized by the U.S. Army and the YMCA. They attended lectures on democracy, economics, and world history, not mandatory lessons, but voluntary ones. In Camp Crossville, Tennessee, German teachers among the prisoners were given permission to organize schools, producing their own newspapers, essays, and art. Some even wrote plays and music, which they performed before mixed audiences of POWs and guards. The Americans allowed this creativity to flourish, recognizing it as a vital outlet. Instead of crushing the enemy's spirit, they had chosen to engage it, and the results were astonishing. Within a year, the camps had transformed from mere holding centers into vibrant communities of learning and reflection. Still, not everyone welcomed this evolution. Among the die-hard Nazis, resentment festered. They saw every baseball game, every English class, every friendly exchange with guards as evidence of ideological decay. In some camps, secret cells of loyalists tried to enforce German honor, threatening or even attacking those who showed signs of American influence. In one documented case at Camp Tonkawa, a prisoner accused of being too friendly with Americans was murdered by hardliners. The incident shook the War Department and prompted stricter separation policies. The Americans realized that beneath the surface of order, a psychological battle was still raging between the old world of fanaticism and a new world of humanity that was taking shape within their fences. Over time, however, even the loyalists began to falter. The relentless consistency of fairness, the predictability of meals, the politeness of guards, all these wore down the armor of ideology. It was difficult to cling to hate when the enemy handed you breakfast each morning and wished you a good day. Some prisoners began to write letters to their families, urging them to question what they had been told back home. Others, upon release years later, would recount how these experiences changed their entire view of the world. They had entered America as soldiers of the Reich. They left as witnesses to a different kind of power, a power rooted in mercy, not fear. As 1945 approached and the war neared its end, the camps took on a new atmosphere. Radio broadcasts brought news of Germany's collapsing fronts, of cities in ruins and leaders in hiding. The men inside the wire listened in silence. Some wept quietly, others stared at the horizon. The guards said little. There was no triumph, only understanding. They shared coffee with prisoners, spoke of peace, and assured them that when the time came, they would be treated honorably. That promise, simple and human, meant more than victory speeches. And then, on a quiet May morning, word spread through the camps. Germany had surrendered. The war was over. The prisoners gathered in small groups, some stunned, others relieved. A few sang softly, not war songs, but hymns. The guards stood respectfully aside. At that moment, the line between captor and captive blurred completely. Both sides had endured years of fear and uncertainty. Yet here they stood together, alive and strangely united by shared decency. For the German POWs, the realization was profound. They had entered America as enemies and would leave as witnesses to its ideals. What they carried home was not humiliation, but an understanding that power need not always come from domination, and that even in victory, compassion could be the greatest weapon of all. The next phase would be the aftermath, the reckoning, the return, and the memory of how kindness behind barbed wire changed thousands of men forever. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the war may have ended on paper, but for hundreds of thousands of German prisoners in the United States, a different kind of journey was only beginning. Inside the camps, news of surrender spread slowly, first as whispers, then as radio bulletins, and finally as official announcements read aloud in the mess halls. Many prisoners sat in stunned silence. The empire they had fought for, the ideology that had promised glory, was gone. In its place was uncertainty and, strangely, gratitude toward the very nation that had held them behind wire. In the months that followed, American officials began the enormous process of repatriation. But it was not as simple as putting men on ships and sending them home. Europe was in ruins, transportation lines shattered, and governments barely functioning. The War Department decided to stagger the releases, prioritizing the sick, the elderly, and those captured earliest. For many prisoners, it meant months, even years of waiting. During that time, life inside the camps took on a new meaning. With the fighting over, tension eased further, and the strict military routines softened into something resembling civilian life. Prisoners organized concerts, art exhibitions, and sports leagues. Camp newspapers flourished, publishing essays and poetry about peace, guilt, and rebuilding. For the first time, the German POWs had the freedom to think about the future. American guards noticed the change. Reports from the Provost Marshal General's office described the camps as calm, orderly, and productive. Incidents of violence dropped dramatically. In some camps, guards stopped carrying rifles altogether. The prisoners, in turn, began volunteering for extra duties, maintaining gardens, fixing fences, and even teaching local farm children German. They were no longer captives in the emotional sense. They had become guests of a system that had chosen humanity over humiliation. Outside the wire, nearby communities began to notice too. Farmers who had once been wary of using enemy labor now spoke fondly of the German workers who helped save their harvests during wartime shortages. In many small towns, friendships quietly formed. There are countless stories of POWs invited for Sunday dinners, of shared Christmas gatherings, of townspeople gifting tobacco and fresh pies through the fence. In some cases, bonds endured long after the war. Letters crossed the Atlantic for years between former prisoners and American families who had once hired them for field work. One Kansas farmer famously told a reporter, "They came here as Nazis, but they left as men." Economically, the POW system had also left a quiet but powerful imprint. Between 1943 and 1945, German prisoners contributed millions of labor hours to the American home front, harvesting crops, building infrastructure, and keeping industries alive during manpower shortages. The government paid them a small wage, as required by the Geneva Convention, which they could use in camp canteens to buy toiletries, snacks, or extra cigarettes. To many prisoners, that simple act, earning and spending money freely, symbolized a level of trust and normalcy they had not known in years. It also taught them something profound about the dignity of work in a free society. But the most lasting impact was psychological. In countless interviews conducted after the war, former POWs recalled how their time in America shattered the illusions built by Nazi propaganda. They spoke of the shock of seeing African American guards treated with more respect than they had imagined possible, of watching democracy function smoothly even amid wartime rationing, of realizing that freedom did not mean chaos, but confidence. These revelations were not theoretical. They were lived experiences absorbed day by day in the small routines of camp life. By late 1945, as ships began to carry the first groups of prisoners back to Europe, many of them felt a strange sorrow. They were eager to see their families, yet reluctant to leave the stability and kindness they had found in captivity. For some, America had become a moral refuge, a place where they had rediscovered humanity after years of blind obedience. When they boarded those ships, they carried more than luggage. They carried the quiet lessons of baseball fields, hot meals, and fair rules, lessons that would outlive the war itself. But the story did not end at the docks. Once they returned to a broken homeland, these men would face a new struggle to reconcile what they had learned in captivity with the devastation awaiting them in post-war Germany. When the German prisoners finally returned home between 1946 and 1947, they stepped off the ships not as conquering soldiers, but as silent witnesses to a very different kind of power, one built on discipline, abundance, and dignity. What they found waiting in Germany was unrecognizable. Cities like Cologne, Hamburg, and Dresden lay in ruins. Roads were shattered, families scattered, and hunger haunted every street. The contrast to their American captivity was almost unbearable. In the camps, there had been structure, food, and routine. Here, there was only chaos. Many former POWs later admitted that they felt more disoriented returning home than when they were captured. The comfort they had experienced in enemy hands now felt like a memory from another life. The reintegration process was difficult. Some Germans resented those who returned from America, accusing them of being softened or re-educated by the enemy. Others listened in disbelief, as former prisoners described baseball games, hot showers, and guards who treated them as equals. No one believed us. One ex-POW recalled in an interview decades later. They thought we were lying to make defeat easier to bear. Yet the stories spread quietly, through families, through communities, through letters. And over time, these accounts began to change the way many Germans saw their former enemies. The idea of America as a brutal, materialistic land faded. In its place grew a complex respect, a recognition that democracy, for all its flaws, had survived the war with its humanity intact. The U.S. government, meanwhile, viewed the program as one of its quiet successes. Reports to Washington highlighted how humane treatment had paid unexpected dividends. American officials noted that thousands of former POWs were returning to Germany with first-hand experience of democracy, fairness, and order. Many of them would later become the backbone of West Germany's recovery. Teachers, engineers, doctors, and local leaders who helped rebuild their country not through fear, but through cooperation. The camps, in hindsight, had been more than prisons. They were incubators of post-war reconciliation. Evidence of that transformation appeared in countless personal stories. Some former prisoners corresponded for decades with their American guards or employers. Others immigrated to the United States years later, seeking the stability they had once known behind the wire. A few even returned as American citizens, their lives shaped forever by the lessons learned in captivity. One man, once a Wehrmacht sergeant, became a professor in Chicago. Another, who had worked on a Texas cotton farm as a POW, later brought his family back to visit the farmer who had fed him during the war. They embraced like old friends. In Germany, too, these men played a quiet but crucial role in reshaping the nation's moral identity. They had seen what decency looked like in victory. They had experienced fairness under the control of a powerful democracy. And when the Federal Republic of Germany emerged in 1949, its founders found allies in these returning soldiers, men who understood both the dangers of blind obedience and the strength of lawful freedom. Historian Arnold Kramer later called them the unintentional ambassadors of democracy, a title they earned not through politics, but through memory. Of course, not every story was harmonious. Some prisoners returned bitter, unable to reconcile the kindness of their captors with the destruction of their homeland. Others carried deep guilt for the war they had fought. But even among them, there was acknowledgement that their time in America had left an imprint that could not be erased. The United States had defeated them militarily, yes, but it had also conquered their expectations, dismantling hatred with civility and generosity. As years turned into decades, the legacy of those camps faded into history, but their influence endured quietly. Former POWs met in reunions, published memoirs, and visited the towns where they had once labored under watchtowers. In those places, they were no longer remembered as enemies, but as men who had shared an extraordinary chapter of reconciliation. America, too, carried the memory, a reminder that even in total war, humanity had not been completely consumed by hatred. For both nations, the lesson was lasting. Compassion had proven stronger than propaganda. Fairness had outlasted fanaticism. The baseball games, the cigarettes, the hot meals, all the simple gestures of decency had done something no battlefield victory could achieve. They had turned enemies into witnesses of a better world. That was the quiet triumph of the American POW experience, a victory not measured in land or numbers, but in hearts and minds that returned home changed forever. In the long shadow of World War II, few stories reveal the paradox of war and humanity as vividly as that of the German prisoners held in America. Behind barbed wire, in the very heart of the nation that had defeated them, these men discovered something they had never expected: respect, fairness, and a sense of dignity restored through simple acts. Hot meals, clean barracks, cigarettes, and baseball were not luxuries. They were symbols of a moral code that refused to collapse under the weight of hatred. In a world where millions had perished through cruelty and ideology, America's decision to uphold decency, even toward its enemies, became one of the quiet triumphs of the modern age. The legacy of those camps went far beyond their fences. They became, unintentionally, classrooms of democracy. Men who had once marched beneath the banners of tyranny now stood in orderly lines, fed by the principles of justice and equality. They learned, not from speeches, but from experience, that freedom could be strong, discipline could be humane, and mercy could coexist with power. The lessons they carried home helped lay invisible foundations for the reconstruction of West Germany, shaping a generation that would rebuild not in anger, but in understanding. For the Americans, too, the experience left its mark. The guards, cooks, and townspeople who interacted daily with the POWs witnessed firsthand the transformative power of fairness. They proved that moral strength could be wielded with the same precision as military might. In treating their captives as men rather than monsters, they safeguarded the very ideals they claimed to fight for. Today, the old camps are gone, their barracks reclaimed by time, their baseball fields swallowed by grass. Yet the echoes remain. The laughter from those games, the clatter of breakfast trays, the murmur of foreign voices reading English newspapers, all were small sounds of civilization surviving in an age of destruction. They remind us that even amid total war, humanity is not lost. It is a choice made one small act at a time. The story of those prisoners is not just a footnote in military history. It is a testament to what happens when mercy becomes strategy and when the victors of war choose to remain victors of conscience as well.